Matthew's plans for his summer cruise had gone badly wrong. Originally, the plan was that I would help get the boat up to Scotland. Maureen would join him at Inverness, and the pair would then spend the summer cruising the Western Isles. But now Maureen's mother was seriously ill, and there was no prospect of Maureen making it to Scotland any time soon. The Autohelm had packed up, so Matthew couldn't safely sail single-handed, and repairs would take at least a fortnight, with no certainty of fixing it at the first attempt. The new plan was that I would stay on the boat and help him get it to the Clyde, where it would be easier for him to fly up and down to Scotland, and where repairs would be easier to arrange. Hopefully Maureen would also be able to make short visits. Whilst waiting for the engineers to do their thing, we erected the conservatory to keep off the worst of the Scottish weather. Having seen what local boats did, we lashed up this fender board contraption. In hindsight, after having done 2 canals, with a board this big, it worked better just hanging the board outside the fender. After spending 2 days in the marina, waiting for a diagnosis on the Autohelm, we decided to get on with it. The next morning, we radioed the Sea Lock, who said that as it was neaps, there would be more than the 1.4 metres of tide they required all day, and that they would leave the lock open for us if we set off straight away. The staff throughout the Caledonian Canal were very friendly and helpful. They operated all the lock controls and for the most part would take your line. On the bigger flights of locks with several boats per lock, they did ask you to tend your own line sometimes. Having paid his fees, Matthew said that he had an appointment with Cally Marine in an hour, which was only 2 miles away. They patiently explained that whilst it might only be 2 miles away, we had to pass 1 rail bridge, a road bridge, and 3 more locks. We would just need to get used to the pace of canal life. Yeah.
Tell them to hurry up.
After passing through the rail bridge, we moored up to wait for a motorboat to come through the next flight of locks and for the road bridge to open. Having operated the hydraulic controls to raise us up in the first lock, the keeper took our lines and walked us through into the next lock. This was much easier than throwing and catching lines, particularly as Matthew had invested in 2 50-metre lengths of 20mm nylon. Great for shorelines, but too heavy for throwing from the bottom of deep locks. By the time we transited the Caledonian and Crinan canals, they were looking pretty scuffed. If I were doing it again, I'd get a set of cheap polypropylene lines which would be easy to throw, and it wouldn't matter if they got a bit frayed around the edges. Looking back, we could see that we'd already been raised up to the height of the Inverness Bridge. Cally Marine was mainly occupied by rental cruisers, and it must have been changeover day, because a lot of obvious beginners were being taught how to handle their boats. The idea of going through locks with this lot wasn't very appealing, but they turned out to be the least of our worries, as they rapidly disappeared when we got to Loch Ness. At first there are weirs where the canal spills over into the River Ness, but it soon opens out into the loch itself. Although undoubtedly very scenic, we found Loch Ness rather gloomy. There was no sign of any wildlife. Forget Nessie. There was no sign of any fish or birds, just a steep-sided gorge with hardly any stopping places. One of the few places you could stop was the bay next to Urquhart Castle. This had a long history of being fought over by the Scottish kings and the Lords of the Isles. It was eventually deliberately blown up in 1692 when English government troops pulled out. There looked to be enough left to be worth a visit, but we wanted to get on. There we go. Oh Christ, even deeper. That's what confused us before. That's what had my crew panicking.
It must be 201.
At Fort Augustus, we were moored close to the old Sunderland pilot boat, Wearmouth. She had already had one go at squashing us in the berth at Inverness, and we feared, going through the lock, she might prove to be our nemesis. It's a small world. We discovered whilst chatting with Wearmouth's crew that his dad and I had both served at RAF Valley at the same time in the 70s. So in all probability he'd been a patient of mine. The flight of locks at Fort Augustus take you up to the level of Loch Oich, the highest point in the canal. Only Wearmouth and us wanted to get through to the head of Neptune's staircase that day, so it was inevitable that we'd be paired up. Going up there wasn't a problem. We let Wearmouth enter each lock first, and when she was safely tied up, we went in behind. Or at least we did when there were no other boats in the lock. We followed Wearmouth through the road bridge and into Loch Oich. We found both Loch Oich and Loch Lochy to be more interesting than Loch Ness. There's more wildlife, more stopping places, and whilst the local scenery wasn't as spectacular, the distant scenery certainly was. It was just before this shot at the Lagan Locks at the entrance to Loch Lochy that Wearmouth next threatened to squash us. This was the first descending lock, and as the water went out, Lynn let the stern bits jam, and before we knew it, the stern was hanging from a thin bit of polypropylene rope. They were just about to cut it when the lockkeeper saw the problem and let the water back in. As we got to the end of Loch Lochy, we got our first sight of Ben Nevis. Not quite clear of the cloud, but with plenty of snow showing in the gullies. From the end of Loch Lochy until the sea, the route is now completely canalised. We found that if we got just the right distance and angle behind Wearmouth, there was a sweet spot where we could maintain speed but ease back on the throttle. Finally, at the end of the day, we moored up in the basin at the head of Neptune Staircase, in sight of both Ben Nevis and the sea. We booked in for the first transit of the staircase the next day. Azura, a large German motor cruiser who we'd first seen in Peterhead, was also booked in, as of course was Wearmouth. That left us with a problem, whether to go alongside Azura or Wearmouth. In the first lock, Matthew opted to be alongside Azura, but having seen the powerful thrust from both her engines and her thrusters, we thought we would take our chance alongside Wearmouth in the next lock. After all, they wouldn't get hung up again, would they? Unfortunately, they did get hung up again, but this time Lynn was loudly proclaiming her innocence. The lock staff eventually raised the water levels again, but not before something gave way. Ooh. To be fair, the German skipper was very competent. He controlled the boat with a mobile handpiece like an Xbox control. However, it would only have taken one overlong press of the thumb to crush us. After descending Neptune Staircase, we moored up in the pool at Korpak. Only Wearmouth and ourselves were locking out straight away, and we had to wait for her to refuel. She had a 7-litre Gardner engine, which used about 2 gallons an hour at 6 knots. Tickover gave her about 6 knots, and flat out was about 8. Whilst we were waiting, the Jacobite, better known as the Hogwarts Express, came through Korpak station. At first we were thinking in terms of just getting to Oban after locking out, but looking at the tide tables, we decided we could just make it through the Sound of Luing to Crinan before the tide turned if we kept our speed up to 6 knots. We had seen the outside of the sea lock before in 2010. On that occasion we were lent a mooring on the far side of the lock by a local who was living on his boat whilst he built a house. We were interested to see what he built, and assumed it must be the chalet on the left. Today the weather was more typical of Scottish weather than on our last visit, and the top of Ben Nevis was nowhere to be seen. Going down Loch Linney, in lack of an autopilot, Matthew devised this remote steering control with 2 lines going to the wheel. He later revised it with 1 line opposing a bungee. On the Corran Narrows, the roll-on roll-off ferry was rushing back and forth. Fortunately, there was little tide to complicate our avoiding him. I had a go with the improvised steering, and in flat water it worked quite well. I wish we'd thought of it on the long cold night up to Peterhead. With this we would have been able to steer from the hatch, rather than freezing at the stern. Finally the wind picked up, allowing us to sail, or at least motor sail, as we still needed to keep our 6-knot average up. We jibed onto port so that we could sail inside Lismore, but when we got there the wind died, as I suppose was expected. The wind picked up as we neared Oban, but we decided to stay outside Carrera as we thought we'd have more chance of hanging on to the wind and make better speed. As we entered the sound of wind, we nearly had one of those classic navigational foul-ups. I said we should leave the lighthouse to the right. Matthew said he wanted to leave it to the left. I said, well, it's your boat, but it's a long way out of our way, and the tide's going to turn soon. It was only then that we realised he was talking about this beacon. He hadn't actually seen the lighthouse, which was hidden by the sail. So we were both aiming at the same point, just talking about it in different terms. The wind came round onto the beam, and we began to make decent progress. We had lost sight of Wearmouth some time ago, but suspected they had gone to look at the Corrib Wrekin. Sure enough, they peered out of the Corrib Wrekin just as we were hardly up to Captain Doris Moor. The tide had been with us all the way from the Sound, but as we got to Doris Moor it was hammering out of the gap with 3 knots, and we needed a quick burst on the engine to get us through before it really wound itself up. We arrived at the sea lock long before the advertised last lock-in time, but these fishing boats had taken up station and we couldn't raise anyone in the office, so we gave up and motored round to the harbour, pick up a mooring there.